Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. We now move into the debate side of this evening's affair. My name is Malcolm Thornton, and I've been asked to act as your chairman for the evening. Around the table, in front of you, you will see what we've called our panel. This isn't intended to be a sort of local question time. They're there because they all, in their own way, have got particular areas of expertise which feed directly into the social care field. And they're there to offer to any of you who want to ask questions, their thoughts, their advice, their comments, whatever they may be. And that's the reason why they're there. So they won't all be answering every point, and it will be for them to interrupt if they want to have a burning statement to make, or for me to say, well, this might be something that you want to handle. So can I just introduce the panel, members of the panel to you? We have the Honourable Mrs. Justice Parker, Judith, who sits here. She studied jurisprudence at Somerville College, was called to the bar in the Middle Temple. She was appointed Queen's Counsel in 1991, and she specialises in family law and is also a judge in the Court of Protection. She's also done an awful lot of other things, as they all have, but time presses on. We've got Assistant Chief Constable Julie Cook. Julie has a particular responsibility in the local police force for corporate and criminal justice. She's responsible for all the officers and staff who police our community. So she's very much at the forefront of liaising with people, the people who need some form of social care. John Diveling, who is there between and sitting next to Julie, he's the Senior Responsible Officer for Cheshire and Wirral, the 5-year Forward View Delivery Plan. He was previously Chief Officer of Wirral CCG, and prior to that was the Director of Operations and Delivery North for NHS England. Dwayne Johnson, at the end, is the Director of Social Care and Health for Sefton. Very much at the sharp end. I need to say no more, Dwayne. Professor Michael Lavalette. He's the Professor of Social Work and Head of Liverpool Hope University. Michael is the National Coordinator of the Social Work Action Network and has been a keynote speaker on many occasions such as this. Yvonne Castle is the CEO of Johnny Johnson Housing. Many of you will be very familiar with that famous photograph of Johnny with his big cigar. Very much involved, again, working with housing associations, key deliverers in the social care field. And we also have two gentlemen who are sitting here on my right-hand side, the brothers Smith, Ian and Stephen, whom we were talking earlier, I've known for 49 years. And they are the co-authors of a paper which has, shall I say, stirred up the waters somewhat. It's a paper which has gone at national level, has been well received, and they are going to give us a brief summary of this paper. And I believe that what it will do is stimulate much of the comment and questioning which we will have. So can I invite you, Stephen and Ian, to come along and give us a summary of your report.
Good. Thanks, Malcolm. It's very, very good of you, Stephen and I. We're going to do this together. We're going to try and keep this to about 10 or 15 minutes so that we can open up a good debate. The way I'd like to start is just to say, you know, all of us have opinions about health and social care in the UK. We've all had experiences. Many of us work in the sector. And I think it's important at the start to declare, if you like, what perspectives each of us is coming from. And to ask each of you as we have the debate to imagine that there are different ways of viewing this problem. And let's try and get a debate, a productive debate around a subject that I think we all agree needs to be solved. I'll introduce myself briefly and then Stephen. My background is in management, so I started after university, after school in Birkenhead. Went to university and worked first for Shell in the Middle East, a 40-year management career, and most recently I just stepped down as chairman of Four Seasons Healthcare, which is the biggest elderly care group in the country with 20,000 residents, 35,000 staff. So I come at these issues, from a sort of strategy point of view. What is the strategy? What should we be pursuing? And particularly management. How do we manage through this? And that's a very unique, or not that unique, but it's a specific perspective on that. Stephen's taken as we parted in 1969 when he went off to medical school, has had a very different career.
You want me to talk about very quickly? I've been what's called a clinician scientist. I spent all my life in innovation, mostly at the University of Cambridge, which also got an excellent, by the way, and then at Imperial College. But I went to the dark side, rather like Hector was discussing earlier, from the academic set, particularly in data analytics and genomics, which is an important point, but actually onto the management side. So I was responsible for the first really major structural change in academic medicine in Britain, which was the creation of academic health science centres, which is a way of trying to get innovation into healthcare. What we're going to be arguing this evening, and hopefully with you arguing, is that we absolutely need to change things. We need to completely disrupt the system that we have at the moment. It will not deliver what we require from a modern healthcare system, and I'll be making some comments as to how I think we need to do that.
So it's obviously a very troubled area, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about Steve and myself, because we were raised in a very hostile environment, because we are Manchester United supporters, raised on Merseyside. And actually I remember at primary school over in Birkenhead, my teacher suddenly saying during class one, "Smith, I believe you're a Manchester United supporter." And I said, "Yes, that's right." He said, "How the hell are you a Manchester United supporter living on Merseyside?" And I said, "Well, my parents are Manchester United supporters. My dad's originally from Salford, from Lower Broughton, so we were, we support United because they're United supporters." And he said, "Well, that's bloody stupid, I mean, what if your mother was a shoplifter and your dad was a drug dealer? Would you still want to be like them?" And I said, no, then we'd be Liverpool supporters. So that's probably offended half of the audience. To kind of, we're going to do this very, very quickly. I hope some of you managed to read the pamphlet. The system that we set up in this country in 1948 was perfectly fitted to the epidemiology of disease and social need in 1948. People died on average at the age of about 60. In fact, average life expectancy for people born in the 1880s was 45, although we had high infant mortality. So people died at the age of 60, 62, and they would die within 6 months of their terminal illness. We didn't have the challenge of the frail elderly. We didn't have the challenge of out-of-hospital chronic disease management, because people died of those diseases in those days. We've now made those acute diseases chronic diseases and can be treated out of hospital. So there was really no need for social care, and mental health was handled, as we would now, I think, all agree, rather brutally, in that people were locked up in mental asylums. So even as late as the 1950s and 1960s, between 150,000, 200,000 people locked up in mental asylums with the key thrown away. Now, things have changed dramatically since 1948 because of the advances in medical science, which Stephen will talk a little bit about. We now have an aging population. We have chronic disease management in the community, so cancer care, which you will survive. You can survive cancer in a way that you did not in 1948. Diabetes is on the rise because of lifestyle choices. So we have a very different need for the health and care system now than we did in 1948. In 1948, we really had district general hospitals that did relatively simple operations, and we had a GP network that largely dispensed antibiotics, following the great discovery of Alexander Fleming's isolation of penicillin in 1928, and that was fine. But the challenge that we face now is completely different. We've knocked down the mental asylums, and we've allowed the people, quite rightly, with mental health issues to go back into the community, but we haven't changed the system. We haven't put the care into the community to look after those people with mental health needs. We haven't put the money or systems or pathways in place to look after the frail elderly. 850,000 people now living in the UK with dementia, and that figure will go up to 1.5 million in the next 15 or 20 years, unless there's a miracle cure, and frankly, it's very unlikely that there is going to be a miracle cure in that time frame. Now, these sort of demographic trends have been known for some time. And many people will agree, and most of you will be familiar with the left-hand side of this, that we need integrated out-of-hospital care. We need to keep people out of hospital. It's incredibly dangerous and expensive for a frail elderly person to go into hospital inappropriately. A frail elderly person, especially living with dementia, who's in an acute ward for a week will lose 10% of their muscle strength, and they are unlikely ever to get that back. We are literally killing people by not managing out-of-hospital care for our frail elderly population. So we all agree that we need integrated health and social care out of hospital, and we need to manage chronic conditions. The other part that Stephen mentioned, and he'll talk a little bit about, is we're also seeing a dramatic revolution in biomedical science. And if it wasn't urgent enough, and I think we'd all agree it is urgent, to fix the out-of-hospital care environment, it is also very urgent to fix the hospital network environment. Steve, do you want to talk a bit about this?
Well, you heard a little bit before about Hector. One of the problems is that the transformation in understanding massive systems has occurred without actually much communication with the public. Only last week, an Ipsos Mori poll indicated only 9% of the British public had heard the term machine learning. Now that's at the absolute basis of this massive explosion of data. So we're trying to suggest here changes in structure and function of our health and social care system, when actually, if you like, the science, the maths and so on, have already gone. They're already 2 or 3 steps further down the path. So in trying to explain, because this is our health and social care system, it's very, very difficult to do that when a fundamental and absolutely catastrophic, century-wide change has occurred in science, when the public actually don't fully have have a very, very limited understanding of that change. And so when you're trying to introduce things which seem like change, because it's hidden so far away from the reality, it makes it doubly complicated, which is why we're trying to stimulate this debate across the country and here this evening.
So in the paper, which you'll be pleased to hear we're turning into a book, we go into our view of what the problem is with the system, where we need to get to, and more importantly, I think, how do we get there? Because, you know, we've talked about this demographic change over many years, and so we need to find the mechanism. So I'm going to leave you with this, and those of you who read the pamphlet are not allowed to answer this question, but I wanted those who haven't read the pamphlet, or those who can't remember what the pamphlet said, who said this and when? A hospital plan makes no sense unless the medical profession outside the hospital service will be able progressively to accept responsibility for more and more of that care of patients which today is given inside the hospitals. It makes no sense, therefore, unless the medical profession outside the hospital service can be supported in this task by a whole new development of the local authority services for the old, for the sick, and for the mentally ill. Who wants to guess when that was said and by whom? Come on, you've got to have a guess.
Nye Bevan in 1948.
Nye Bevan in 1948 is a good guess, but it's wrong. That was actually in a speech by Enoch Powell in 1961. So we knew in 1961 this was a problem. So I'm going to finish there, and we're going to go and open up the debate. And the debate is, why are we stuck in 1948 or 1961, and what needs to happen to get this country and the people of this country to a better place? Thank you very much.
Well, I said that they'd stirred the waters up, and I think you can see why. But I think the reaction that I've gleaned from most people about this is that nobody really disagrees with these points because they are actually self-evident. Whether it was Enoch Powell way back then or what we know today, it is self-evident. So perhaps this would be a good starting point to actually look at these issues to see how they can relate. Title of this is Who Pays, Who Cares? Well, we all have to care, and we certainly all pay. But in a play on words, do we care enough? And we all pay in different ways, not just through our taxes, but we pay in the costs that we have to bear as individuals in our communities. So it's a composite problem. There are solutions. Has our society got enough about it to be able to tackle these? These are issues which can topple governments, as we have seen very, very recently, if they're not handled properly. What I think we can do tonight is to look at these things. People around here will have views. People around this table will have specific areas of responsibility. So can we now invite some comments around this table, around the room, any questions, and we'll see where it takes us. I'm going to try and keep some control so we don't focus on just one issue, but actually deal with several questions during the course of the next hour or so. Who would like to start the ball rolling? Thanks.
Just a thought, Chairman. There are clear problems, and we all recognise them. Should we be trying to solve those problems as we see them today with technology and knowledge of today? Or should we be cognizant of the fact that people like Google and Amazon are now spending billions on their healthcare divisions looking to see whether their technology can assist in individual diagnosis and answering those problems as individuals through technology?
This might be a question that you want to handle.
Well, as you say, they are doing it, and that is where the private sector is engaged. In fact, it's far, far further on. Actually, Google tend to be at the customer, if you like, level. The business-to-business type stuff is already happening. For those unfortunate to have a malignancy, most malignant cancers now are dealt with by mutation analysis, by genome analysis, and it's a computer that works out the best way to treat that case. And there are increasing massive explosion in that data. So it's already happening. I think the real question is sort of who cares and who pays and so on. These changes are truly disruptive, and truly disruptive changes occur without the public knowing. None of us had a committee to sit around and think we want to develop iPhones. And one of the problems we have in Britain is that we have this mentality, this paternalistic mentality, that we'll have a committee of the great and good and something will happen. In this space, it's disruptive, and my worry is that it'll happen and we'll all turn around and go, God, what happened then? And it might not be good. That's one of the points that we're trying to get across. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Anyone else take up this point? Yeah, sorry.
Can I just bring my...
I was very struck with the comment, we absolutely need to disrupt the health system, which is what you're talking about. And we've just had a disruption with the elections, where a lot of the commentators of a certain age were clear something would happen and then had no idea what happened because they weren't listening, where a lot of other people young people were watching videos on Facebook that had been published, and it reached them. So where are we involving other voices and minds, a lot of them involved in the technology industry? who see things completely different to most people who are engaged with the problem and having been engaged with the problem for a long time.
Thank you. Yes.
There is a saying that real change only occurs when the cost of not changing outweighs the cost of the change. And I'm not sure we've reached that cost of change moment yet. My hope, my wish, first and foremost, is that we take the politics out of the health and social care system. I think that where you have governments working within 5-year cycles, there's always a political temptation to meddle. This should be the one area that we look to achieve cross-party consensus on. Whether it is on no more top-down reorganisation of the NHS, said David Cameron, and then weeks later, and we take a long-term view, because it will require a long-term view. The view of public health, tackling the vested interests, whether that be food manufacturers, too much salt and sugar, the whole sugar-fat debate. What I hope is at some point our politicians stop squabbling, bring in experts and say, how can we fix this together? Because this goes beyond politics. And I wonder at what point will our politicians show real leadership and actually put their ideological beliefs to one side for the good of the country.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. I couldn't agree more with that. If you look at social care, over the last 20 years, we've had 4 independent reviews, we've had 7 white papers, we've had numerous green papers, and every time we reach a point where we think we're going to solve the social care issues, we seem to move with a different government or a change in government approach because it's too complex. The public won't accept it, they won't like it. And I agree with the gentleman behind me. I think there's been too much of it, and I think we're all pretty fed up of it. I think we need a cross-government party to look at how we're going to work on solving the crisis and the funding issues within, certainly in social care.
Thanks, Dwayne. That's good. Steve just made the point. It might be helpful for everybody if, before you make a comment, you just say who you are, just for the benefit of everybody around the room. So, yes, please.
Good evening. My name's Sedi Frederick. I spent almost 30 years as a chief executive of a number of provider organisations in the disability and older person sector. I now have what they call a portfolio lifestyle, which means I can say yes to work, I can say no to work, but I currently work for myself.
Right. Now, Dwayne makes an interesting point here because he's at the sharp end, where local government has got the responsibility of delivering so many of these things. But I'm a great believer that if they have responsibility, governments give the responsibility, they've also got to will the means. Now, this has clearly not happened in many cases. And one of the questions which I think flows from where we are at the moment is quite clearly, as Steve and Ian have said, the present system is no longer fit for purpose. Whether it's reached that breaking point, that tipping point that you've just mentioned in your comments, but is it just a question of throwing more money at it? Is it just a question of saying the NHS is something which is out there on its own, people can be as fond as they like of our NHS, but would throwing money at it solve the long-term problem? Yes, Yvonne.
I absolutely think it's partnership working. I think between us all there is, I'm not saying sufficient funding, but I think if we pooled our funding, our resources together, we could certainly make a big difference. We're doing, as Johnny Johnson Housing, a little bit of work with Manchester CCG to help the Step Up, Step Down by providing homes that are independent living with some of that support to avoid people going into the hospitals and to help them when they're coming out. And I think if we did a bit more of that together with the housing, the health, the care, I think we could move quite a few milestones.
Thanks, Yvonne.
John.
You mentioned, is it bad enough? Well, it is bad enough, quite frankly. To quantify that in terms of outcomes, you only need to look at our survival rates for cancer, our poor access for waiting times, the pressures on the referral to treatment times, the number of patients who are on long waits now within the NHS, and to quantify that against certainly a Cheshire and Wirral population where we know the over 85s will increase by 10% over the next 5 years. What got us here won't get us there. And the NHS was never designed to do that. I think the trouble is we've tried to redesign it so many times. We've created silos of foundation trusts. We've put public health in different budgets. We've separated ourselves from social care. We've created so many divides that actually there isn't a single place where we can have that partnership. Although I have to say, those partnerships are developing now, because we know that the burning platform, if you like, for me in Cheshire and Wirral is if we don't do something, and we don't do it together, our health and care financial gap in 5 years' time is some £350 million if we don't do something. So we have 4 acute trusts in deficits, we have every CCG in deficits, so the system itself is broken now. So, and I think we recognise that. What I do think we're starting to see, though, is that those pressures are bringing people together. And I think we are beginning to see different types of conversation. Whether we need some legislation to help that along, the politicians don't want to get into. But the irony is, my colleague over there was talking before, what we didn't want was change, and we got change. And what we're all asking for now is some space in order to help us change, but there doesn't seem a willingness to give us that space to change, which I think is a strange irony.
And perhaps a searing indictment. Michael, you wanted to comment?
Excuse me. Yeah, I suppose I want to be a little bit contrary here, but the problem is I don't think that this can be apolitical, and I don't think it can be taken out of a political vacuum and treated separately. When we go back to the origins of the NHS, it's not the case that there weren't other progressive models around in parts of London. There was all sorts of sort of GP practices who had all sorts of preventative strategies in place, but the NHS system sort of rolled over them as much as anything else. So we've had a long history, I think, of the NHS, which was a very institutionalised and quite bureaucratic system, but nevertheless, for the vast majority of people, the NHS was a reform that made their lives better. And the problem I think we've had for the last 30 years is that in political discourse, increasingly, governments talk about reform, and the experience of most people is that those reforms don't improve life, they make life worse for them. It makes them, it increases inequality, it increases poverty, it means there's more bureaucracy, it means that there is less jobs for them. So ironically, when I was growing up, my parents were growing up, reform meant improvement and improvement to our lives, and now that language has changed, so reform immediately turns off as they're taking something away and it's going to get worse. So that doesn't undermine what the brothers Smith are saying, but it does mean that anything that goes forward is necessarily in a political context, and we have to deal with that political context in that very particular way. The move from asylum to care in the community, in the abstract, was an absolutely right thing to do, but if it's not funded properly, as Ian said, it was never funded properly, then it becomes part of the problem, not part of the solution. So, I know there's an awful lot of us that sound like the women in Bristol 6 weeks ago who said, what, they're having another election, there's just too much politics out there. The problem is that this all necessarily is political, we can't get away from it, and the whole debate about adult social care and the whole debate about the NHS necessarily is embedded within that context and how we respond to it. So the question then is, some of the reforms properly understood that we're hearing about, these are developments that you get in other France across Europe. This is what the healthcare system looks like in other parts of the world. But it's about convincing people that those things can happen in a way which don't restrict access, which don't cost us individually money. Of course, it costs us money, but it costs the society as money rather than individuals, and that this can be a step forward in improving care for us all. So in a sense, it's about more welfare, but better welfare, more and better, rather than just either cuts and austerity or going back to what it was like in the 70s. We can't have either. We've got to have more and better, in my opinion.
Is there a general view that what we've just heard is the case, that it's impossible to take the National Health Service, the broader issues, out of the party political arena with some sort of cross-party approach to this? Do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Well, just following on from Michael, I agree with a bit, and I disagree with a little bit. In terms of us hitting the buffers, I actually think it's another 5 years. I think the middle class has got to get a lot more discomforted than they are at the moment. The people who are really vulnerable are already in deep distress. You know, I was really mad about almost everything about the election, but I was particularly mad that the debate was about, you know, limiting the cap. You know, the people in our homes, 85% of our residents in Four Seasons Healthcare are local authority funded. So they've already got net assets less than £23,250. Out of the 450 care home residents throughout the country, probably 200,000 are local authority funded. They are dying. You know, the care home sector is going to close because of the underfunding in the next 3 or 4 years, 50 to 100,000 beds. And we've got a total bed population in the NHS of 100,000 beds. So, you know, let's figure that out. So this is already, and it was really angry about, you know, not leaving my house for my kids and all that. And I understand all of that. It is important. But nobody talked about the pain and suffering that is happening currently to the people who do not have voice, who are on local authority funded care, living with dementia, and frankly, dying. So, but I think it'll take another 5 years or so until the middle class really get upset about this, because, you know, it's their parents and it's their inheritance that they're going to get. So I worry that it's going to be a bit more time before it can go. I think on the politics, I think we've got it's our fault, frankly. We're allowing the politicians to get away with this. Let's stand up and bloody well be counted, you know. You know, 73% in a recent Ipsos Mori survey said that they believe politicians of all parties do not do what's best for the British people, but do what is best for their political spin. 73% of the population. You know, we're sitting here letting this happen. You know, we've got to stand up and be counted. We've got to have more voice on this. Final thing I'd say, which I agree with Michael on, the problem is, as soon as you talk about change in health and social care, people think two things immediately. It's going to become unaffordable, and it's going to become inaccessible. And until the politicians and we start getting our minds around answering those questions, then we're going to get stuck for many, many more years.
Thanks.
Thank you. Francis Street, with a background in NHS and social housing, but I speak as a layperson because I read your pamphlet, albeit some time ago, and my immediate reaction was, oh my God, this is a car crash. A car crash.
Yep.
And it feels as though the country hasn't quite woken up to that car crash that is, can't be far around the corner. Like it or not, it's these, you know, to deliver change, it's still in the political arena, and we all know where we are on politics. In the Queen's speech, there was absolutely nothing to address any of these problems. You know, there's some great brains around this table, and difficult it is to predict what's going to happen over the next 5 years. Can anyone here see a solution to what we know is about to implode? And is it going to take that car crash for the country to wake up and take some painful decisions?
Anybody want to pick up that question?
I mean, surely though, I'm just going to add to that, but surely that the question that I suppose is the final phrase there about painful decisions. And the question then is does it have to be a painful? Because you can bring in reform that meets people's needs in a way that doesn't have to be painful, if it is properly funded, and we're clear about that, or else it can be painful. So, I mean, that depends what we mean. And in a sense, that's the political question. I wasn't meaning party political. I mean, these things are political.
But that is there not an assumption in what you've just said, that you're trying to fix the present system, rather than looking at the question and answering the question of the fitness of purpose of the present system for a demographic which has changed so dramatically? I think this was the point that was coming out very strongly in what you were saying, that the demographic has changed, that what it was designed for, it's no longer capable of delivering, and therefore it does require a radical solution. I can ask the question, is it more money? Is it an all-party approach to this? A cross-party approach, a non-political approach? It is one of the big political issues. It has been as long as I can remember. And every party is upping the ante, saying they'll give more money, they'll do this, they'll do that, they'll do the other. The net result is we've still reached this potential car crash. So, these are the issues.
How can there be a
Judith.
cross-party approach when there's a fundamental political distinction between attitudes as to who pays? I think that I'm speaking entirely as a layperson, nothing to do with my area of work at all, but that's what it seems to me to be about. I'm not expressing a view one way or the other. It seems to me there's a divide between people's approaches.
Well, at the end of the day, of course, we all pay. The people who pay, the public, government doesn't.
But the question of who pays what?
Yes, it's a question of proportion between how much the individual should pay as an individual and how much they should pay through their taxation system. Because governments don't make money, they spend money, our money.
Sorry, Mark, I think that's an important issue, but I do think it's probably a secondary one, because what we're discussing here is the system. Once we've actually got some idea of what the system is, we might then be able to work out who pays and who does not pay. The problem at the moment is that the system is so broken. We don't know what the system is. We haven't actually consensually agreed what the health and social care system is we're arguing about. And that makes it so fundamentally politically difficult, because both sides are arguing about something which we haven't actually begun to discuss or decide what the problem is in the first place. So it is a crucially important issue. But until we have a clearer view ourselves of what the system is, I still think we're going to have difficulties struggling with that point.
Yes.
Excuse me. Chris Wood. I was a chairman of a NHS acute trust until last year, when I also stepped down. I've worked with the brothers before, I have to say, and we've had many a conversation. My question is really about it. It's, in a sense, it's about what the system is designed overall to do. So what's the objective for any individual prospective citizen who may well then access any part of the care pathway for whatever reason, and what is it we're trying to do at the end? Because certainly my experience has been, as a chair of a trust, is that the arm's length bodies pretty much, right, just test you against objectives which are in some way designed to, I think, feed the political system, to feed the apparent transparency that they care by saying, you have to be looked after within 4 hours of attending A&E and so on and so on. But they're arbitrary. They really are arbitrary timescales. They don't have any real meaning, I believe, in the sense of whether that's right for you or not. And the same is true of the Care Quality Commission, who are there to improve standards, but against what? And they seem to be all arbitrary measurements. So my point is, I guess I'm asking the panel, what do you think the overall outcome, what is the objective that we're trying for this, and I agree, to disrupt the system should be? Is it, it can't be mortality anymore. That's been pretty much discredited in a sense. Maybe it hasn't. So what is the data? So what is it? Is it longevity? Is or is it something to do with, if you wish, a better standard of living, inverted commas, as you move through whatever your lifespan is? I'm really interested to know what it is we're trying to achieve.
To hog the discussion, but I think there are some. This is exactly the debate. What are the outcomes? One of the outcomes is a value-based healthcare system, and for some of it, it's not the whole thing by any stretch of the imagination, but there are some outcomes, like your chances of dying from cancer, like your chances from dying in a car crash, like your chances of dying from a heart attack, which reduce life expectancy and kill people. There are some things which are pretty hard barriers. And as John rightly said, one of the sad things in Britain is although our equanimity in healthcare is not bad actually compared to other countries, our actual hard-line health outcomes, cancer survival, cardiac survival, stroke survival, is one of the worst in the world. And until this is the road, we've already hit this wall. People are dying. Yeah. And so there's something there. But you're right, then there's other issues about longevity of care and access and so on. But there are some things which are seriously broken at the moment. So I think that is part of the debate.
So we would change that if we were able to change that.
If we were able to.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I don't want to hog the proceedings, but I think, the key is outcomes and experience. As Stephen says, and we say in the paper, we do have some of the worst health and social care outcomes in the developed world. This is not, it's free and it's accessible, but in spite of that, we have some of the worst health and social outcomes as well, so social mobility, teenage pregnancy, this is really serious stuff. And one of the problems is we are stuck in the institutions of 1948. So try to, as Stephen might talk about, consolidating stroke units in London, which has improved outcomes by 17%, taking 40 stroke units down to 8, against huge opposition of Save My Local Hospital and Save My A&E and so on. We've got to confront this with real data, because that is a big part of the problem. I think one of the criticisms I have of the NHS, I think Simon Stevens is a good guy, and I think he's trying hard and so on. But I think too many of his reforms are top-down. Let's reconfigure the system, new care models, new service delivery models. I would take a very different approach. I would identify vulnerable groups of people in our society, which we know who they are. It's the frail elderly, it's the mental health, it's early-stage cancer. We know who these people are, and they're named individuals, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Jones. This is not an abstract concept. And, we read about delayed discharge in hospitals. You're really talking about 50, 60 individuals with names who are the people who are bouncing in and out of hospital inappropriately, and as I said earlier, dying. I think we've got to try to get people away from my career in the NHS or in social care is managing an institution, managing a hospital, that's where my career is. And shift it, and this sounds easy, but it's not, to saying let's manage vulnerable individuals, cohorts of vulnerable individuals. I don't want to flatter Dwayne too much, but Dwayne is one of the most innovative people I've come across in social care as a commissioner, and he really is leading edge in what he is trying to do, and I'd love to have his views on this. What I would do is take that budget, just take it off the local authority. They failed, We've got high discharge, bed blocking. We've got people dying. Take that money off them, take them off the healthcare budget, identify the cohorts of people, and Dwayne knows their names. These are people, who exist. Give the money, give Dwayne that money to put a package of care around each of those vulnerable people. In the case of frail elderly, it's probably 2 years or so till go through to death with a good palliative care package, and put the money around that individual and manage that person throughout a whole pathway. And stop that person bouncing between GP surgeries, acute hospitals, care homes, domiciliary care. That's the revolution. If I've got an answer, because I don't want to be negative, that's the answer I would give. And, if you've got your wallets at the end of the evening, if you could donate to Dwayne to prime the pump.
Dwayne, I'll bring you in a minute, but I know, Michael, you'll get a question.
Thank you. Michael Brown. I'm chairman of the Alder Hey Children's Charity. And so I observe national healthcare close up, but I'm not a party to it. I help to fund it a bit, not the NHS bits, the extra bits that children need, and research in particular. But what I've seen of the NHS is really quite distressing. And the work of the hospital is, of course, wonderful, and they do wonderful things. But the way in which the complexity of the organisation, the way that patients flow in and out of hospitals and the money flows with them, the barriers of handover in both in and out of hospital is really horrendous. And because of that, there's waste there as well. But it's clearly not fit for purpose. We talked a little bit about whether this could be taken out of party politics. It can't. There's too much vested interest in there. And politics is about making choices, and the politicians will make the choices. The problem is that politicians aren't able to make these choices, really. Most of them are professional politicians that don't have any experience in much apart from politics, and certainly not a lot about healthcare apart from what they hear. And they're on short-term horizons, short-term responses, a hostage to public opinion and all of the local Save My Hospital, which we just heard about. And Ian really has stolen my bit I was going to say just a moment ago, which is slightly frustrating. But in my experience of these things, it's a question of follow the money. You know what the objective is. The money drives the service. And a lot of the complications in the health service are transferring bits of money from one part of the health service to another, not actually how you get the maximum value out of it for the particular patient and circumstances concerned. So the point I want to make is it's the money flow and what are you going to do with the money, stupid? But it's also about helping the poor politicians who are stuck in a very difficult political system, and they can't win either way. My experience of politicians is if you give them something that they can see is going to be a success, they'll back it, but you need to give them something they can have confidence to back, and they're not going to lose face and lose their position. So we come to the question of, and I know this won't get much sympathy, is how do you help the politicians to help us? How do we get an expert plan, which the politicians cannot do? There has to be independent, credible, futuristic and looking for the next stage as opposed to now the future-proof plan. And that means bringing a group of impartial, non-politician experts together to give a route map for politicians to test and adapt. And if they think it'll work, cross-party, they may have a chance of adopting it. But this is not a 5-year plan, it's a 20, 30-year plan. And they need our help from someone. Maybe it's us, maybe it's somebody else. But the politicians do need help. Because as you said, Malcolm, they've been grappling with this in one form or another for 20 years. And we don't see much progress apart from disastrous reorganisations, which make it more complicated than less than helpful.
Dwayne, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, a comment I'd like to back on Ian's comment. Thanks. You taped that, didn't you, before? So thank you for that. I think you get what you pay for, really. And so I'll come back to that comment. And also, if you look back, let's just go back to Ian's point about history. If you look at before the implementation of the Community Care Act in 1993, nursing care was the responsibility of the NHS and it was free. Residential care was provided predominantly by local authorities, but the private sector had entered the market. Significant numbers of people were funded through DSS. The government at the time didn't like it, so they gave it to local government. And they gave it to local government to do two things. The first thing was to restrict the number of people going into care, so it would save the government funding. And secondly, it was to promote independence, and I'll come back to that in a second. Local government, unfortunately, and I don't want to be in this position, has done really well at saving money since 1993. It isn't just since austerity, it's since 1993. I didn't come into local government to do some of the things that I'm having to do now. I started as a care assistant, no qualifications, and I've gradually worked my way through the system, worked in the care home system, ran my own care home in Durham County Council, which they closed because of cuts. So I've gone through all of that process, but we are very successful in local government at cutting, and that's what we've been doing, and it's very painful to do that. However, coming to the innovation and some of the things that I think we can do, I think for me, there's too much time and energy from my NHS colleagues trying to fix some of the social care and medical problems around delayed transfers of care. There's far too much focus and energy and time going into that, and we need to change that pretty quickly and change that mindset. At the opposite end, though, there's a public malaise, personally, around prevention. People aren't bothered now. You look around, you look at, unfortunately, my area in terms of Sefton, we've got significant numbers of people who are obese. People aren't taking personal responsibility anymore for their own health. And we need to address that, and we need to focus far more of our time on prevention. Because if we don't do something with that right now, we're still going to be having this sort of debate in 5, 10, 15 years' time. So we need to address the problem now that we've got. And I do believe it is about funding, as well as other issues. And we also need to look at what's happening in our society now with either our younger people, our middle-aged people, and we need to focus far more of our time around the prevention and health promotion messages.
Thanks, Dwayne. Julie.
I suppose just echoing some of what's been said really, I think from our point of view in the police, we end up dealing with at least 20% of our calls involve mental health to some degree. And that's probably rising actually all the time. Talking of prevention, you know, I think that's absolutely where we've got to be to try and be getting upstream of where the problem is, not dealing with the crisis, because A, it's very expensive to do that. We've lost it by that point anyway, haven't we? And I think some of the work that we're trying to do now is around very much, you know, the partnership approach. And obviously we've all been talking partnership for a long time, but we really do have to work in partnership to be identifying those vulnerable people, as already been said, or vulnerable locations, so that we're all looking at it to see what can we all put into that to actually make a change to what is happening, but doing it as far as possible early on. Now, the only problem with that, we don't necessarily deal with stuff early on at the moment, so you kind of increase your demand. Some of that stuff that's upstream, we're just paying lip service to it at the moment in a sense because we're dealing with the crisis end, but we need to try and get upstream, stop people getting into the problems that they are, deal with the issues, whether it's obesity or whatever it might be, to prevent them getting into the crisis. But as I say, that increases our demand to start off with. But if we can deal with it effectively, it doesn't work its way into the more difficult and challenging areas to deal with. So, you know, we're trying to do stuff around adverse childhood experiences and trying to see if there is ways that when we're going into people's houses that we start to pick up on those early signals of something that could develop into, you know, that crisis further upstream. So I think there's a lot that we can do working together, but trying to bring it forward really to where we are at the moment quite often in what we're dealing with.
Judith. Just say from my perspective, I entirely agree. It's a great issue, and the earlier you need to think about it.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, it's Dave Clarkson from IBM. So earlier on you were talking about what is the system, and I think part of the problem is probably that there isn't just one system, is there? There's a number of different systems, health and social care systems which don't work well together. You just mentioned around edged into the public health arena as well in terms of prevention as well, so there's a public health part to that as well. And that's, I think, through a pragmatic answer to how do you bring those together. So one of the things we could do is feed the ideas from this to make those things work better together into the SDP thinking, for example. But there is short-term pragmatic answers, which Ian was talking about as well, which I thought was really interesting as well.
Thank you. Yes, you wanted to.
Hi, Louise Davis, Development Director of Savini Homes. So we're a local housing association operating across Liverpool. I just wanted to come out really from the housing perspective. For the last 2 years, government policy on housing has been silent on specialist accommodation or equally on older persons accommodation, with very little funding being made available. We're a regulated sector, and my view is that we do have an obligation to be addressing some of these issues. Housing associations now are more and more innovative. We're becoming more commercial and are making money to be reinvested into these communities. But I think just looking down the road to Manchester, where we've got a complete devolution agenda, I think there's still some issues locally within our own region here in terms of getting to that full devolution agenda. But I do genuinely believe that housing associations have a big role to play in this whole agenda.
I'd like to explore this idea of collaboration a little bit more, because it's been mentioned several times, and there does seem to be a fair degree of unanimity in this particular respect, that working together, some of these problems can actually be tackled. I'd like to hear some views from both people sitting around the floor, as well as anybody sitting on the panel, as to how much better we should be at actually trying to work together. There is a silo mentality that we have in this country which militates against this. And I think if we can break that silo mentality, we can start. But what are the barriers? What are the barriers to collaboration? Dwayne? No, sorry.
I mean, I'm going to shamelessly make a plug. I mean, if we look at the history of the welfare state more generally, there was one group of professionals who, in my opinion, had those generic skills and who did work with people in housing and adult social care and child protection and health, and those would be social workers. The problem is that the way that social workers are treated is part of the problem. You know, they're demonised if they get decisions, whatever decisions they take, they have excessive hours and whatever. But as a group of professionals who work with individuals, who, as Ian was talking about before, if you take about the 50 or 60 named people who had a budget and who should put a care package in, actually that's exactly what the social worker is trained to do. But we don't treat them with the value and the respect I think that they deserve. And I think if we're thinking about breaking down those silos and working within all those areas of welfare, from housing right the way through, social work does have to have a key role and needs to have a higher prioritised role.
Yes, Yvonne.
My view, absolutely, I'd said earlier about partnerships. I'm really pleased it's been echoed. I think there's a number of things where there's challenges. If we think about development, the housing sector has stepped back from building because of not knowing how homes would be funded. So there's an element there of some of the government legislation. My own view is I think we need to just crack on and do it and not necessarily wait. Trying to work with the local authorities on land, very political issue, coming back to some of the politics of where will people free up land to build homes is one of the barriers. I think the other element of partnership working that we've started to get better on is with suppliers, and interest in Alistair's presentation around the technology. And we're certainly talking more to suppliers who are now up in their game on supporting new developments in technologies for prevention. And I think that prevention agenda is something that we do have to keep pushing on. So I think going back to the very first thing that was said around technology, you know, why shouldn't we be talking to the Googles, the Amazons, because they're the ones that are innovative, entrepreneurial, coming up, making a market, creating a market, as opposed to a lot of people following.
John, and then lady.
So just to catch up on the debate a little bit, because I think we've got an NHS which is, in inverted commas, free at the point of delivery, and social care which is means tested, and that's part of the problem. Because how can you create pool budgets when one organisation looks suspiciously at the others? And I'm a friend of Dwayne's. And I think we both recognise that. So the successive policies have driven us apart. I'd mentioned before Foundation Trust. The whole status of Foundation Trust has also been a policy. Payment by results, allegedly, has been another tariff-based system, which might have been okay then, but isn't now. So it seems to me that we have to say, how much do we value health and care? Forget the question is not who pays for it. That's what comes out of. How much do we value our older people in this country? How much do we value looking after vulnerable people in this country? So we have to be a value-based system first and foremost. Then you can answer the money question. But and I just want to put a big play in for primary care, because primary care see about 85% of all patients. That's our first point of contact with the NHS, and primary care itself is in crisis in terms of recruitment and in terms of the number of people that they're seeing. So we have talked about institutions, and I get that, but let's not forget there's other parts of the system that are also struggling. I think we have got some really good pockets of very, very good practice emerging now. And where we see those, the problem is we're not very good at adopting that and adopting it at pace. It took the NHS about 10 years to adopt the barcode. Seriously, when I started off a bit like Dwayne, I was at the front line, I was a nurse, and I used to go to the path lab and get blood, and I have to check it off 4 or 5 times off patient notes. Barcodes existed in those days, at 100% foolproof. And so for about the 6 years it took the NHS to adopt the barcode, we potentially were giving the patients the wrong blood because we didn't adopt that best practice. So there's a real issue for me in adopting best practice, and there's some really good practice, and where we're seeing that is people coming together in partnership to say, what are the wider determinants of ill health? What's the housing situation? What's the employment situation? What's the lifetime opportunities that these people have? And we are looking at things like hypertension. So 40% of the people in this room now will have a hypertension or a high blood pressure, and you don't know about it. And yet you're at risk of a stroke, and I don't know who you are. And if you come into A&E, we don't know who you are. And if you're comatose, we may even give you the wrong drug and kill you. Because we don't know who you are. So when we say, you know, we know our population, we don't. We don't know who they are. We don't know the high-risk people. Because if I ask a hospital, who are the people at high risk, there are a different number of people to those being managed in primary care. And there are a different list to the community care, and there are a different list to the police, and there are a different list to the fire service. So only by coming together can we say, who are the people who are most at risk? And when we know who they are, we need to ask them what they want, because it's not what we give them now. And when we know that, then we can manage their care. But we have this approach that we think we can manage the care, so we'll give you what you want. And what our offer is, it's institutionalised care. And the work that we were doing on Wirral, which I think is, I'll give you an example of it because I think it's a promise, I think it's a potential, is we have diabetologists, they're people who work with diabetic patients, who have said, my job is not to look after the people who are referred to me in the hospital. My job is to look after everybody on the Wirral who has diabetes. And that's a fundamentally different approach to care because it's what we call population health. So the consultant doesn't look after who gets referred, they look after the whole population and support primary care, keeping people out of hospital. But our system doesn't reward that. Our system only rewards those people who go into hospital. And so your question is not an easy one to answer, but there are many layers that we need to break down. Partnership is one, I think values is one of them, partnership is another one, but then also the ability to use budgets in a much more imaginative way. Quite truthfully, I wouldn't quite do what you said with budgets. I'd like to see my innovative way would be to take social care budgets, to put them back into a central pot of money, to increase them, but to come up with a new formula for the population and give that back out to the system so we didn't have this idle debate about, well, who pays? But the system manages the payment system, and you get a sum of money that's indicative of your population. So it's population-based health, not on can you afford to pay for it. But that comes back to what value we as society place on our health and care.
Thanks, John. Yes, there you go.
Just going back to the barriers of working with partnership, it's more about being able to, when something goes wrong, taking responsibility for it. Because often enough, people who work together defer the responsibility, so it's not those who it's not the singular person who's getting blamed, and everyone partially is to blame. And I think with partnership, it's about information sharing, because if you are not sharing the information that you need to between each other, whether it be social worker to a GP, anything like that, that's when things start to go wrong. And just going back to the value of value of the person, I think it needs to be more of a holistic approach and person-centred. We're often enough saw as figures in stats or the money that's being spent, rather than you should focus on, does this person needs help and we need to help them regardless of, obviously I know there's money restraints, but regardless we should all care for each other.
Thank you. Judith.
It's been known for at least 30 years that the key to efficient child protection is joined-up thinking and collaboration between social services, healthcare and the police. It seems to me from my work on court protection and healthcare issues that you don't get that kind of joined-up thinking and joined-up meetings within the medical system in which social workers are often involved. And of course, the criminal investigation aspect of joint planning probably doesn't affect the care of elderly people in the same way. It seems to me that a lot could be transported from child protection practices into the kind of issues we're talking about. But the other point I wanted to make is on a personal level. Did anyone listen to the recent lectures, Dr. Atul Gawande, talking about accident prevention in hospitals? He imports assistance from the way in which the aeroplane safety is managed. It's simple, you have a checklist and you stick to them. And it seems to me that my reading, which is pretty superficial, that this is something that is not actually really important to self-protection at all.
Thank you. Bert.
Thanks, Malcolm. It's unusual for me to be silenced for so long. But obviously some great contributions. It does seem to me, though, that somebody made the point about how irrational it is that health care is free at the point of delivery and social care is charged for. And that has huge implications on disabled people. Just to give you one example, a friend of mine in London is only allowed to keep in the bank 23,000 or so. She has a care package of £50,000 a year. When her car suddenly disappeared, she was faced with a bill for an adapted vehicle of 40,000 quid. No way she's allowed to raise that, because if she does, she's suddenly into 50,000 quid a year for the care package. It's absolutely balmy. And then the government's also added more problems onto the table with the bedroom tax and other things. So there's been a whole pile of hits which have made disabled people more vulnerable. And what's happened within social care? I mean, you wouldn't believe social care in the 1970s compared to where it is now. It was nowhere near 1948. It was superb. Disabled people got holidays on the council, went off to Mallorca and all sorts. I mean, social care was actually really about well-being, about giving people confidence, about helping to get on with life. And local authorities wouldn't even consider that these days. And what's happened over the years, certainly since the Barry Gloucester case in the mid-90s, is before then local authorities could not take account of their own resources before deciding whether somebody had a need. They had to be quite objective about that. Since that case, they can take account of their resources, as a consequence of which many people who qualified for care now don't, or didn't from then. And it's got tougher and tougher since, because local authorities have been trying to manage the budgets. And that's meant many people we're talking about tonight are those with the most severe needs. The majority of those people are not there yet. They've got lesser needs, and the social care system actually has nothing to offer. And that's causing huge distress, really across the country. But they're not emerging because their needs are not seen as serious enough. So in the case of you all know the case of the bedroom tax, you lose an accessible property, then your parents are bathing you in a rubber pool in your lounge. That's what happens when you start taking that all away. So I think we do need to rethink the financing. And I really don't accept the money's not there. They're saying social care is £2 billion underfunded. Well, they've taken £4.5 billion off it, so I doubt that figure. But £2 billion is what the DUP are asking for the government. I mean, we can't find £2 billion in this country. We've got a problem. And I think if we could start intervening earlier, we could stop people going to hospitals. Why do people fall in their home? Because the plugs are too low. So why are we still building homes with low plugs? We could change building regulations. We could build homes that are accessible. We don't need steps at the front so people can fall down them. And if you're going to look at social care, you've really got to look back at just about all parts of society. Why did children leaving school suddenly lose all the equipment they had in school? Because the Education Authority funded it, and once they leave school, there's nobody to fund it. And these are not new problems. These have been around for 30 years. It's just getting deeper and deeper. So in any social care debate, one, I'd like to see more disabled people involved in the debate, because they're the people being affected. And, you know, we hear that it's old people blocking beds. Old people don't block beds in hospitals, because if they're old and fit and healthy, they're fishing or on the golf course. They're not in a hospital bed. They're in a hospital bed because they're old, they're ill, or they're disabled. So it's illness and disability are the issues rather than the age. And we're saying, well, we're short of beds. Well, we heard earlier we've got 100,000 beds in the health service. In 1985, we had 300,000. So could part of the problem be we've got more people? Or could part of the problem be somebody's pinched the beds? And I think we need to go back and start asking those questions. You know, the cottage hospitals, which were at least inexpensive, what happened to them? To save money, so someone on a couple of £100 a night, we keep them in hospital at over £1,000 a night. And it does need a really fundamental, and I was thinking what Michael Brown said earlier about the politicians. I mean, I agree with you absolutely, totally, Michael. It's, we both dealt with them for far too long. But actually, there has to be a coming together of the parties, because no policy can be delivered within one prime ministership. And the one thing we don't need, and we get it constantly, is as soon as the new government, of whatever colour, suddenly we've got a new idea, a new way of doing it, which is largely ideologically based, and from all sides. And I think that's where we need to bring people together, so we can have a system which is based on people, on management, on rationale, and not based on the whims of the new minister.
Thanks, Bert.
Yeah. So I'm Mike Thomas. I work for Grant Thornton. We audit a lot of the public sector in sort of this area and across the country, and I've spent 25 years doing that and felt frustrated across most of that time because all the people around the table join up at the local level, but the national picture is different performance measures, different indicators, and some of that's been alluded to today. I think I just like the table view about, is devolution the answer to some of this? So you talked about sort of sharing and having more powers locally to actually respond and determine local outcomes. But within all of that, somebody needs to be accountable. So, you know, we've currently got, I work across Greater Manchester and into the local city region. There's different regional mayor sort of structures being put in place around all of that. But is that the right level? Or is it Sefton, or is it Liverpool? I mean, I've seen LSPs come and go, I've seen health and wellbeing boards come and still in place. Are they actually all working to the same outcome for the local people, and who would be accountable and best placed to actually deliver the best bang for buck from those monies? Because I think you could just keep throwing money into it, but if there's a sort of a level of money that we agree is sort of probably the right amount, it probably generates innovation. I'm seeing lots and lots of innovation, lots of great collaboration, lots of great partnership working, but I think there could still be more to be done and more efficiency to come out of the whole system.
Go ahead.
quality, professional trades, people at the front line. With social workers, we've got good quality social workers coming into the system, etc. It's the front line workers, it's the full care staff, care assistants in the care homes. Some of that's linked with fees, some of it's linked to development. So that's what I would say. What I would say to Mike is I think it's early days around devolution. And does, Matthew Morris in the room tonight, she's been recruited as our devolution lead for social care, and the 6 of us get collaborated to work on that. And we are seeing some green shoots. I think the difficulty is that it's a bit like the NHS in the way we do get it parochial. The one good thing I believe though is that there's a strong political mandate. Possibly that's because most of the British region are all there is Labour. But there's a strong political, and that's not political statement by the way, to anybody, it's just the way that is. There's a strong political mandate to move us forward on devolution. And I think we are seeing some good issues. There are some things that we are looking at. So for example, in terms of bringing some of our provider services together to do some of the good practice things that John was talking about. For example, in terms of re-enablement, or people getting to hospital outside the hospital. We're doing a lot of things collaboratively. I think it's too early days to say whether or not that's going to change anything. I think Manchester's probably a little bit further advanced in that because it was a devolution ask. And I think it'd be very interesting to see what happens in Manchester. In Liverpool, it wasn't that we asked for it, but the Treasury and NHS didn't agree that it should be a devolution ask in Liverpool. But that isn't to say that we decided in the local to have a role to see if we can work with NHS partners to be more efficient, but more innovative and change the way we deliver services.
Thank you. Stephen wants to make a point on this, and then you're trying to get in, and then there's a question I want to try and tackle before we come to the conclusion of our evening.
Well, in the spirit of this evening, I do want to be fairly controversial. There are 2 facts which we are dancing around here. The United Kingdom has one of the lowest number of hospital beds per head of population of any other country in the OECD, and we have one of the lowest numbers of nurses per head of population and one of the lowest number of doctors per head of population. So the first question which I pose to everybody, I'm not quite sure why we get so hung up about hospital beds when we quite clearly are under bed provisioned. The second is when you come to cost of percentage of GDP, we actually spend roughly the same as the French and the Germans in percentage GDP when you include the health and social care budgets together. So it's not true that putting them together, health, we're slightly less because we label it slightly different from the French and the Germans. But when you put health and social care as percentage of GDP together, we're roughly about the same as the French and the Germans. So here we have a pretty obvious statistic on one hand. We put you through everything. We put you through hell. And actually, the answer is staring us in the face. There aren't enough hospital beds and there aren't enough nurses for it, possibly. I'm putting it out as a question. And the second point is the actual money we put in is not too bad. And the final bit I said, having run a hospital, actually the largest in the UK at the time, was a very male comment, I know. You can't run a hospital efficiently with greater than 85% bed occupancy. And when we got the German government and healthcare systems to come at the health service, they lasted 24 hours in London. Because when we pointed out that most of our hospitals are running at greater than 85% bed occupancy, they got the next plane back to Frankfurt. Because it's not possible to do. So I'm just posing the question. There are some bloody hard facts here which we dance around and we put everybody into these conundrums. Well, actually, the facts are sort of staring us in the face.
And strangely enough, that was exactly the point. Exactly the point I was going to make. Although I was really interested, I think, in the last 10 or 15 minutes of conversation around the table here, that seems to, you were talking about partnership working, strongly suggest that actually this isn't just health and social care, this is also to do with welfare, is it not? Because, and I think I heard that quite strongly, is that in lots of cases, welfare is a causal state for people maybe entering into health and the necessity for social care. And we have to remember that the welfare budget certainly has been sliced as well, I think, fairly heavily. So actually, what we used to call, going back to when the NHS was put together, the welfare state, has almost certainly shrunk considerably, I think, in terms of the overall percentage of GDP. I wouldn't know what that is, but it would seem to be. And inherent in that is we've got problems right from the beginning, because I think I'm right in saying about a third of people who use social care are of working age. They're not all at the over 60, the youth club. They're not all there. About a third of them are of working age, which presumably would mean that there are other problems associated with them, which are potentially ones around welfare. So maybe we should look at this in the round rather than cherry-picking each piece.
The question I'd like to turn to in the few minutes that we've got left has really been touched on a couple of times tonight. Originally, when you were talking about the impact of social media on public perceptions of things, Michael was saying about helping politicians, and believe you me, I don't think they need too much help. Are we talking about a major re-education of the public? Because it's that which is perceived by politicians to be the real pressure on them. They've got to answer this ever-growing demand for resources when it's more than just about resources. How would we set about re-educating the public? How would we make them aware of those rather stark but quite simple to understand statistics that Stephen has just given us about beds, nurses, doctors, etc.? Is this a real central point that we have to tackle in this wider debate, this question of re-education? Shona.
We live in an age where communication is everywhere. Hector said to begin with, we've all got iPhones in our pockets. We've just gone through a bizarre election, Brexit before, the American election before that. Communication changes everything. And yet it does seem to me, in this instance, that, and the NHS in general, that the communication gets lost. It is a complicated topic, obviously. We're talking about the numbers and how do we educate the population. But somewhere the communication gets lost about what really is the issue. And it gets lost in sound bites, maybe it gets lost in Twitter feeds, but we're not using the technology around us to educate the public on these topics. And then it ends up becoming a issue, or a little thing that changes something like the election even. It seemed to be a turning point, one piece of communication, rather than the whole impact of what's going on. We're certainly not marketing the problem as best we could.
Yeah. John.
I thought you were going to ask a different question, actually, the way it was going. I think patient empowerment is a really key thing for prevention and intervention at scale and up the line for future demand. Again, to cite something that we're doing on Wirral, we've identified those people who are most at risk. But you know, the people who live with the biggest comorbidity of disease now, and the average age of people who get admitted to hospital on Wirral over the Christmas period was 53. So our older people, and I don't like the phrase, but our frailty strategy used to be over 75s. We know who the over 75s are. So we're now trying to say, well, who will be the over 75s of the future? So it's the over 50s who are now part of the frailty strategy for the future. So how do we keep people well, living healthy lives longer? Not living longer, living healthy lives longer. And that's helping people make different decisions about their lives. That comes back to values again, I'm afraid. But smoking, alcohol, play very much into the broader debate about partnership working. And one of the great successes Wirral had, working with the police, working with retailers, working with the Chamber of Commerce, was to start to take very high volume alcohol off the shelves. You go back to values. Do we think it's acceptable to go into Tesco and walk down an aisle and get a card for a 3-year-old and a bottle of wine in the right hand in the same aisle 24 hours a day? So it's not so much the symptoms we deal with, it's the value that we place on access to these things. So we have to get upstream. The iPad, the technology, my children, your children are all using health apps in a different way now that are beginning to give us more information about our own health. But if I went to my GP with 6 months of data about my blood pressure and say, I think I've got a blood pressure problem, here it is, what will the GP do? The first thing they'll say is, well, I'll take your blood pressure because your blood pressure belongs to me. So we've got to have a whole different education program with health and care to say, if we are going to empower people to live longer and healthy lives, we as a system need to be able to respond differently to it and say it is okay for you to have your own care record. It is okay for you to take control of your life and make those decisions. But we need to help people make good decisions. That's what I think the upstream agenda is all about. In terms of the occupancy, we are around about 98% occupancy. Anything over 85%, you start getting into poor outcomes. We know hospital infection rates start to change. But those occupancy levels are to some extent determined by those people who are waiting for care packages. But that's not the whole story. There are a group of patients who go into hospital, have a 48-hour acute episode of care, and then we don't do anything with them. They need to be in some sort of safe environment. We horribly call them medically optimized because they're no longer acute patients. They're not ready to go home, but they're in this sort of stranded state that actually they need something, but it's not acute care. And we need to answer that question, which I think will answer the occupancy rate. But then we need to be brave enough to say, if we do all those things, if we get upstream, all that's cost avoidance. Is it cost avoidance that we're talking about, or is it cost saving? And cost saving can only be achieved by taking capacity out. And now we're getting into difficult decisions about an NHS which tends to be supply-led in terms of how many beds we've got. We'll fill them. You could give us 100,000 more beds and we'll fill them, but that's not the right thing to do.
Thanks, John. It's 8:30. We're at the end of the session. I sometimes think a debate like this poses more questions than the answers that are forthcoming. But looking around at the nods of the heads and general body language, much of what has been said has struck quite a resounding chord with the people who've heard the comments that have been made, and I thank you all for all those. So where do we go from here? Clearly, I hope that Ian and Stephen will be able to take their paper beyond where it is at the moment, because we have to confront some of these problems. There may be a variety of solutions, but they have to be confronted. What would I hope might come out of tonight as far as we all are concerned? As I mentioned at the outset, the proceedings have been recorded. One of the thoughts that we had is that we would look at the transcript afterwards and see if there's something there which can be distilled to represent a view from this meeting and from this area. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually demonstrate that here on Merseyside we could actually see some of the collaboration which is needed, where we would have people working together to provide perhaps a basic blueprint of the sort of forward thinking which might take us along some of these paths and enable us to tackle some of these particular problems. And I don't believe that's impossible. Yes, we need to help politicians, but we need to give potential solutions which will command the support across the political spectrum. And it's only by doing that that we will get that unity of purpose from the local politicians, from national politicians, to give effect to some of the changes that are needed. And at the same time, we've got to be educated.